Greetings, dear listeners. This is the Remnant. This is not Jonah Goldberg, as I've told many disappointed audiences over the year. This is not Jonah Goldberg. This is Kevin Williamson. I used to start these guest hosting sessions with jokes about coup d'etat, but that seems less funny these days. So I think I will forgive and forget the coup d'etat joke today. I have here today a couple of writers who have a new book out and a conversation that I've been looking forward to since it was first proposed to me a little while back. And I'm going to try not to butcher names here, but this is Devin DeCiantis and Yvonne Lansberg. They are the authors of a book called The Enduring Enterprise: How Family Businesses Thrive in Turbulent Conditions. And if that sounds like it's just a kind of business book title to you, fear not. I think it may be a livelier discussion than you are expecting, because they think they've written a book about family businesses. I think they've written a book about mafias, and we're going to discuss that just a little bit, I think. But in the tradition of the Remnant, we have a good first question for people who've written books, which is, what's your book about?
Well, thanks for having us, Kevin. Yeah, no, happy to share. We actually wrote this book to introduce what at the time was a counterintuitive notion, although it's one that probably feels increasingly obvious to folks who are watching the world unfold around them. And it's that big businesses and small who are operating, particularly in some of the world's most advanced economies, which are often considered to be the gold standard in terms of organizational excellence, actually have a lot to learn from family businesses. Mafia or otherwise, but in particular, those operating in emerging and frontier economies, the ones where it turns out they are actually the dominant form of private enterprise and have built a variety of approaches to managing turbulence that we think are replicable everywhere.
You mentioned you have a concept you refer to as frontier economies, which is I think kind of central to your view of things, and maybe you could explain what you mean by that.
Let me jump in. Frontier economies are economies basically where trust is at a premium. And it is, these are economies in far-flung places like Venezuela or Yemen or Haiti, or you take your pick. And essentially are societies where the institutional infrastructure that we have sort of come to take for granted in the advanced economies are not in place. And our premise is that, as Devin mentioned, family companies that have endured over generations, and not just endure, but successfully thrive in these conditions, have something to teach the rest of us as our own societies are becoming more unruly and facing more uncertainty and change.
Yeah. You guys had a joint essay recently in Salon about the return of crony capitalism. And there was reading that it kind of felt there was a little bit of two tiers for crony capitalism in the sense that I'm a fairly doctrinaire libertarian sort of guy. I take a dim view of active coordination between government and business, and particularly large politically powerful businesses. You guys, I think, would be fair to say, a different view of that. And forgive me if I'm oversimplifying your thesis, but it's that there are a couple of ways to go about it. There's the version that you refer to as parasitic, which is just sort of about extraction and rent seeking and such things, and a version that I think would be more classically described as corporatist or integralist if you're a certain kind of right-wing Catholic, and that's more oriented toward seeing to certain social benefits and outcomes, distribution of gains, and that kind of thing. And so why, besides the obvious reasons of Elon Musk pillaging around doing what he's doing, why write about crony capitalism right at this particular moment in history? And tell me a little bit more about your views of it and what can be learned from it.
Sure, Kevin. I think it's a great question, a great moment to explore this theme. In fact, we didn't go looking for particular strategies when we were writing the book and researching it. In fact, we came across multiple different approaches to building resilience in the face of uncertainty and a lack of predictability. And among the 7 strategies that sort of coalesced that we found recurring in industries that were quite varied and geographies that were quite varied was this one that we described as symbiosis, inspired, of course, by that function in nature the idea of coordinating actions and sharing resources across, nested or interdependent systems. And these relationships we observed, as you pointed out, can either be more parasitic in that one party, gains or has advantage at the expense of another, or mutualistic in the sense that you can create some shared value and that both entities involved in this iterative transaction can gain. And so as we were looking around for examples, in fact, as you can imagine, we found examples of both of these. But we were particularly encouraged by some of the cases that we discovered especially in emerging and frontier economies of this mutualistic form, because we then realized that it's highly correlated with long-term success. And the iconic case for us that we used to kick off the chapter is Samsung, but it really could have been any of the South Korean chaebol, the money clans that were handpicked, if you will, by an industrialist who seized power in South Korea in the wake of rampant corruption and in its floundering as one of the most impoverished countries in the world, and then built upon the backs of these families with some protectionist policies, an industrial policy that would see South Korea rise from becoming one of the poorest, from being one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming among its most advanced. It's just called the so-called Miracle on the Han River, and that involved positioning them to protect them from foreign competition, to give them access to cheap capital, to provide them with an encouragement to build a heavier and heavier industry and ultimately export-oriented industry. And it's since proliferated in a variety of companies like Samsung and Hyundai and LG and so forth. The challenge, of course, is that no strategy is permanent in its capacity to generate long-term benefits. And in recent years, even in South Korea, there's been pushback for reasons that someone that has understood these phenomena as you do can appreciate. There's a crowding out of private capital. If you protect these same businesses for long, they can become sclerotic and less innovative. And frankly, it suppresses the entrepreneurial impulses of the rest of the economy in ways that can feel heavy-handed and have produced a reaction both from a regulatory perspective, but also in the criminal justice system, with several of these scions actually being put in jail, including the current head of the Samsung empire has spent some time recently behind bars. So it's not a panacea, but it is an interesting vector into a possibility for economic development that we've seen played out countless times in emerging and frontier economies, in which we felt like we ought to be elevating as a path to thinking about building stability in the face of rapidly changing regime.
Another point that I think is sort of perhaps obvious, but it's worth highlighting, is this idea that if you want to survive in turbulent times, you cannot afford to ignore what's happening outside your own organization. That taking a proactive view in managing that environment becomes increasingly more important. And we can talk about the strategies and so forth. But at the end of the day, the family's values matter deeply. And in fact, not all family businesses come to these activities with the same set of values. They are as diverse as human beings are diverse. So, making sure that these families understand the responsibilities they have, the consequences they have on the stakeholders that depend on them, is every very bit as important as being proactive in managing the environment.
Yeah, and since you sort of given me a segue to it, I wanted to ask you about this. You particularly must have enjoyed watching Succession for the last few years, because if I'm understanding your biography well, you sort of lived an unhappy real life version of it.
Well, yes and no. And I'll tell you both sides of that. First of all, I found the show to be insightful in certain ways. The acting I thought was superb. But the caricature it painted of the next generation I found really depressing. In my activities, I have been privileged to meet next generation leaders who are extraordinary people, extraordinary in every sense, not just extremely competent, but also with great values and extraordinarily committed to doing good in the world, not just in their own businesses. So, it paints this caricature of the prototypical method, as it were, and it's too bad, because that is in fact what people out there in the world think about family companies, and yet they are the engines of wealth creation around the world, including in advanced societies. So I think providing a more nuanced view of what goes on in these companies is really important. And yes, I have been touched personally by exactly the kinds of dramas that the show depicts. And one of the takeaways from that is, and in fact is something that we weave into our consulting, is making sure these families do the work necessary to put in place HR systems, be rigorous about the selection processes they build into their organizations, because it's so much more than just them at stake, right? I mean, look at the Murdochs and what they're going through, right? And the implications that has for democracies all over the world.
Right, and that's not Afghanistan, of course. That's the advanced world. People
Exactly.
will want to know a little bit more about your history there. It was your family was it an insurance business in Venezuela? Am I
Right.
right?
My father was an entrepreneur. He was originally Dutch. He came to Venezuela. My mother was Venezuelan, and he built a large, insurance company. He started with insurance brokerage, but then he got into all of the areas of insurance. It became, at its time, the largest insurance system in Latin America. And he was very interested in planning his succession. He put in place my brother, who was the chair, and a non-family CEO who had been with him all along. And their plan was to grow the business exactly at a time when Venezuela was heading for a crash. So they got into debt, and then they didn't know how to cope with the aftermath of it. So it was the strongest vaccination about doing this right that I could ever have.
Yeah, my experience with family businesses has been that my early part of my career, I was a newspaper editor, and I spent a lot of time in the 90s with sort of third and fourth generation newspaper heirs.
Oh, yeah, right.
And I'm in no way surprised that all of those newspapers are gone now because they were not the smartest people in the world. But in some ways, it's, even though it's it's the States, which is a very different economic environment from Venezuela, a similar sort of story, debt-driven expansion. Doesn't matter how good the underlying business is if you can't afford the debt service, and
Exactly.
so you end up with the company. Like, I used to work for Journal Register, which owned 80 newspapers that made money, and the company somehow lost money.
Right.
I was an English major, so I'm not sure how that math works, but apparently, I've told this story before, but I have some stock options certificates from that company, and I keep them in a folder in my desk, and the folder says on the front of it, "You are not smart."
No.
And I have a few other things in that folder to remind me from time to time I'm not as smart as sometimes think I am. You brought up South Korea and Samsung. I actually like to dwell on that just a little bit because I think it's an interesting story. And the way you get into it in the book, I think, is sort of what touched my my little nerve about these things being essentially in some ways crime syndicates, although at a certain level of social and national and economic development, it's not a real bright line, obviously. I mean, the original, you all know this story, but I'll repeat it some for the readers. But the original mafia we think of in Sicily starts off as a kind of Catholic mutawin, sort of a moral police enforcing various kinds of sexual etiquette, particularly about prostitution and women's dress in public and sort of sexual harassment and that kind of thing. This is way back in the in the late medieval era, I suppose. And but the evolution from an organization that's there to prohibit prostitution to one that's there to regulate prostitution to one that just simply runs the prostitution business, and also takes on various kinds of state functions, even though it's a private group. And you see this in the modern world too. You see with Hamas as an example of this, essentially a criminal organization that took on state functions. The Taliban, which is sort of one part crime syndicate, one part religious movement. It does both things. So in South Korea, you get the coup in, is it 61? And Park comes in. And as you wrote, that his original plan was to start prosecutions of what he regarded as corrupt, not he just regarded as what were corrupt business leaders. And then he says, wait a second, these are actually I believe your words were ideal partners for his economic development plan. And I'm not saying that they weren't, But I think it's for those of us who live in the post-war era in the United States, who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, the early 21st century. We have a very coddled view of history in the world. We've lived in this sort of the best case scenario in human history, and so I'm far from sneering at that as a likely and possibly even intelligent and necessary way of going about economic development. But so here we have the situation. We've got these, kind of corrupt oligarchs. You've got a government that's come in through a coup, and where do they go from there?
Well, rather than work against the entrenched interests of business and to try to gut the economy, it seemed like President Park decided to work with the grain of how business was actually operating. They tried to regulate and legislate, and his predecessors were so corrupt, in fact, that it prompted the coup in the first place. But it's our understanding that they saw this as a useful mechanism to elevate the country. And this is where the mutualistic piece of this comes through, a necessary evil, if you will, to say that rather than build something from scratch or to test out other developmental models, why don't we leverage of the infrastructures and institutions that currently exist, provide the right incentive systems, and then allow for these select clans to innovate. Now, it could have turned out differently, as it has in other countries. You could look at a variety of places in Africa. You could look at Russia to some extent post the collapse of the Soviet Union, the oligarchs that have emerged there. So there are many other countries in which the parasitic form was dominant, and therefore the economic possibilities and developmental agenda wasn't achieved. But it so happens that under the right conditions, and it could have been Park's enduring leadership, it could have just been that those chaebol have sort of embraced that upwards responsibility and accountability to the government, but their downward responsibility to their communities and the citizens, the ecosystems within which they were embedded, that they were able to sort of move from a status where they were poorer at the time than North Korea and Bolivia, and to a state today where their GDP per capita dwarfs 3/4 of the world's countries.
Enormously consequential and successful story. But also, even as late as the 60s, something really medieval about it too. The sort of programmatic intermarriage between business executives and government ministers and that sort of thing, and building these families that have one foot in political dynasties and one foot in business dynasties.
Sound familiar?
There's just a part of me that looks at it and is just revolted by it, of course, and there's another part of me that looks at it and goes, okay, well that's their story. That's how it happened. And if you look at the history of Tudor England or medieval Europe, it's not all brave knights on white horses. There's a lot of ugliness and grossness and corruption and all that stuff. But this is how those societies developed, and they developed in good ways. So I suppose if there's a question hiding under this pile of whatever I'm talking about right now, is this at some level a case for sort of amoral pragmatism? Jonah hates the word pragmatism, by the way, and but he knows what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, no, I take a different view. I mean, I believe that family enterprises are overall a force for good in the world. I think that the fact that there are certain things about their DNA that push families to have to be accountable for what they do. In other words, when you have a company with your family's name on the products, and you muck it up, it comes back and haunts you. So there's a natural vector that pushes these systems to think about the consequences of what they do. Not all of them do it. And I think in fact, when I teach about this stuff, I use the mafia as an example of family enterprise. So, and the point being that if families are going to succeed and harness one of the things that comes natural to them, which is precisely this identity connection to what they do, they have to do their homework and have the conversations about why are they doing what they're doing, what are their values, and how do those values reflect on what they do. And in fact, in many of the families that we've been privileged to work with, that conversation is happening internally, because their next generations are asking, for example, why do we put out a product that we don't want to feed our own kids? And so that tension is built into the multi-generational mindset that comes with building a lasting enterprise.
Yeah. And do you think this is to some extent a way of making up for the deficiencies of weak states?
Well,
Go ahead,
it's a
please.
great observation, Kevin. I was just going to say that part of what we try to frame in the book is that the conditions within which you can create lasting commercial or entrepreneurial success are different at the base of the sort of hierarchy of stability, if you will, at the earlier stages in the development of an economy than they are in an advanced economy where the rules are essentially set and enforced and broadly respected and mostly transparent and all the rest of that. And in fact, for those companies that are operating as their context is evolving and developing, it's often among the most disorienting moments when, South Korea ceases to be that frontier economy that it was in the 50s and 60s and becomes the economy that it emerged into in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and that the same rules of engagement that were so successful not only for driving economic development, but also private success for the family, flip from being the greatest assets to their greatest liabilities, if you will, because the context has changed. The institutions, the public stabilizers that are out there to provide for a common mechanism for playing by the rules and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that that large oligopolies or monopolies aren't forming and that everybody will have access to opportunity and so forth. Once those are established and you're not used to playing within those parameters, your same approach to doing business and conducting business can very quickly be undermined. And being able to track the evolution of one's context, not only in terms of progress, but regression, as seems to be playing out right now in the US and in parts of Western Europe, and how the rules of engagement may, in fact, and this is again another one of the premises of the book, that we may begin to have to operate in ways that would be more similar in places like, like Mexico or Brazil or China or India, rather than the format of engagement in open competition that has been so prevalent in the West since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, I have a theory, and it's not especially insightful, but maybe it's useful to talk about for a second, that a lot of our social tensions around economic development and businesses and the role of business in our life just has to do with the fact that we live in a shortened evolutionary timeline in terms of social change. So you can look at the history of the United Kingdom and see a system of a series of gradual changes from, say, the Corn Laws through the Thatcher administration and moving in the direction of liberalization. In India, I remember sitting in a traffic jam on my way from Bombay to Pune, watching people dig a trench for hours with hand tools. And, this could have been a scene from the 15th century, except they were laying fiber optic cable. And, things move very, very quickly now. And so you've got a situation in which things that would have been 100 years or 200 years of social evolution are now 20 or 30 years. India is a different country than it was in the 1990s today. And it's probably changed more in a shorter period of time than any other large, complex country in history. We're just not used to seeing that kind of thing. You can see small countries change really radically in a short period of time sometimes, often through occupation or colonialism or something like that. But these big, diverse, complex countries don't change that quickly. And so we see this in places like you mentioned Brazil earlier, which is a good example. South Korea is kind of maybe a case that straddles this, where you got that sort of, mid-century kind of thing going on in the 60s and 70s, and then a kind of radical turbocharging at the end of the 20th century. China obviously is a huge example of this, where it went through, what would have been 150 years of economic development in a relatively short period of time. So how much of our attention do you think is that we're operating on a change timeline that's faster than what we're used to, and maybe faster than what we are? I'm no expert on evolutionary biology, but maybe faster than what we're wired to be able to process and deal with. That's my question. Question mark. Is this something inherent to our time, or is this something? Or is this something that's just being driven by technology and our experience of the world?
Yeah, no. Go ahead.
No, please, Ivan, go for it.
Well, there is a sense that time is compressing in terms of our ability to, keep up with these changes, for sure. And in fact, part of our interest in family enterprise is precisely that they can be a countervailing force to that kind of rapid change, in part because they are able to think by their very nature with a much longer time horizon. These are people making investments for their kids and for their grandkids and beyond in some cases. So the very, again, this is another vector that's built into the DNA of family companies. But yeah, I mean, if you I've been fascinated by some of the experiments going on around the world in trying to build mechanisms to help people think about the long-term consequences of the decisions they're making. So, for example, in places like Scandinavia or like Japan, they have a future committee built into the parliament. And some people who are by design charged with taking a look at any law that's making its way through the process and anticipating what the consequences 2 generations down are going to be of taking this stand or that stand on whatever it is that we're working on.
But you have to be a certain kind of society to make that work. Because can you imagine the version of that committee in the U.S. House of Representatives? Marjorie Taylor Greene in charge of it?
Oh, well, right. Yes. No, I agree completely with you. You have to have a certain kind of institutional frame. But if you think about the institutional framework of the U.S. in its inception, our founding fathers basically did have the foresight of anticipating all of the consequences, not all, but many of the consequences we're now living. I mean, you just, read Madison and you will see what he talks about exactly on these issues.
Yeah.
You
just mentioned something that made me think of a slight point of disagreement I had with a section in your book. And that was toward the end, the section on diversity and diversity's role in societies and businesses. And I've read a good deal about this in my writing about Scandinavia and their social welfare systems. And there is some literature to suggest that, a certain measure of diversity is pretty good for a society, pretty good for a business, pretty good for an institution. A lot of it may not be. And some of the most successful societies we have are really pretty homogeneous, Denmark, Japan, places like that. And this isn't really for me so much a point about diversity, which is, I think, nationally really even hardly worth debating because societies just kind of are what they are. And even in, the UK where they've had this, national convulsion really over immigration, it's not going to change the composition of the country very much. But it's more of for me an observation about how much of what you can do is simply fixed and limited by where you are and where you have been and the nature of the country you came up in. Sweden has had all sorts of different governments over the years. American progressives tend to think of it like it's stuck in 1974 and it's this like super left-wing social democratic government when in fact it's, went through some pretty radical changes in the 90s and in some ways is a more capitalist system than the United States is by some measures. Back before the people over at Heritage went crazy, their rankings of their International Freedom Index was actually pretty useful and pretty interesting, where the United States would generally come in around, 11, 12, 17, something like that. In countries particularly people on the right, like to sneer at a little bit, like Sweden or Norway, actually come up really quite high because they've got things like really strong rule of law and transparency and good government and those sorts of things. These are things that countries would love to just legislate into existence. And you started off talking about frontier economies as being a place where trust is at a premium. And of course, what really characterizes the Scandinavian countries is very, very high levels of trust, which radically lowers transaction costs. That makes life a lot easier if you want to run a big, expensive welfare state with really, really high taxes, having lots of social trust and very, very low transaction costs between people in the state and the institutions that actually administer their welfare system is a necessary thing. The United States feels to me like it's moving pretty quickly in the opposite direction toward being a much more low trust society than we were even as late as the 1990s. And I wonder if that's your observation as well. And if it is, what can be done about that? And how can your observations about family businesses inform that?
Well, first, just to echo the observation, or several of them, Kevin, one that trust seems to be eroding pretty much everywhere, not just exclusively in the US and advanced economies, but around the world, and for a variety of types of institutions, government institutions, private institutions, nonprofit institutions, and of course the media as well. And so there seems to be a broader trend at play, whether through intentionally undermining these institutions, or some other cultural phenomenon that is playing out. But it certainly feels like we are regressing to an earlier stage in our development as a species, where familial connection is increasingly important, and trust in strangers or the other is becoming more fraught with risk. Pairing that with your observation about Scandinavia, I think it's a terrific one. The idea that Francis Fukuyama and others who was studying, sort of the evolution of societies and institutions and so forth, that getting to Denmark is the thing that all societies are trying to achieve and so forth, is exciting and tremendous and inspiring and insightful, and is fraught with risk, because not all economies or societies are geographically constrained as those ones are, being islands or pockets of clusters of islands and so forth. One, two, culturally homogenous. And so when you're creating institutions to trust the other, if that other looks and talks and acts and has similar values to mine, it's a lot easier to say, yes, let's invest in the whole system. But when I look out the window and I don't recognize anybody, it's a lot, just intrinsically, just our sort of reptilian brains react to that in a different way that makes this more complicated. So diversity is helpful up to a point, as you said, but beyond a certain point, it can actually produce even more dysfunction. To guess or to hypothesize, I think, is more ideology as to where any one society is and where it should be going. But as Yvonne likes to joke, too much diversity is akin to walking into the cantina and the Star Wars, where all of the different species are coming from different planets and no one person can talk to the other. That's not particularly conducive to commercial activity either. So you need enough of a common language, a common set of ideals, a common understanding of the rules of engagement in order for commercial life to flourish, not so little that it's a monoculture, and not so much that trust breaks down and that we resort into these more familial sort of micro ecosystems or micro bubbles of trust within which we'll operate, but which we never pierce to try to engage in trade or commerce with others.
Jonah, who I'm sitting in for today, in his book, The Suicide of the West, we kissed up to the boss here a little bit, but it actually is a really good and useful way of looking at things. Repeatedly refers to his thing he calls the miracle, which is not just the Industrial Revolution, but the social changes and institutions that went along with it and made it possible. And we've all been living for the last couple hundred years in a really, really unusual period in human life. You get 300,000 years of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, more or less, with a GDP growth rate of approximately zero for the first 298,900 and whatever years of that. And then suddenly the world takes off. And, you go from reading by firelight to having electric lights over the course of about 300,000 years. And then you go from Kitty Hawk to the moon landing in a couple of decades. This is a precious thing that I think needs to be conserved. That's why I think of myself as a conservative. This is the thing that I'm trying to conserve, are the institutions and ways of life that have made this possible. And what would you identify as the big risks to it, and the potential bulwarks against those risks? Because it seems to me that your interest in family business is not in a political sense of the word, but in a more general sense of the word, inherently conservative. You're talking about organizations that, as you say, are looking at a long-term timeline that may be more risk averse in some ways. Certainly looking to maximize gains over a period that isn't between this quarter and next quarter. And I wonder if you've got some thoughts about broader kind of socioeconomic and sociopolitical lessons to be drawn from that might be of interest here.
Go ahead, Devin.
First thing, Kevin, I will say that absolutely it does take a long time for these institutions to be built. And as you can imagine, as you just described, this sort of asymptotic rise in the world's economic output as well as its population have followed a long string of accumulating investments in what we like to think of as public stabilizers, public institutions, starting from aqueducts and roads and so forth, but all the way through to the soft infrastructures of regulators and markets and so forth that have allowed strangers to trust one another and therefore to engage in commercial life with one another beyond those that we know, which is obviously cognitively quite limiting as well as practically quite limiting. And one of the quotes that we highlight in the book, and I really love this, from Gordon Brown, a former British prime minister, is that in establishing the rule of law, it's the first 5 centuries that are always the hardest. The challenge is that we tend to think of these things as evolving so quickly in decades and so forth. But in fact, the fundamentals have been put into place going back. You can go back to the Magna Carta. We're looking back almost 1,000 years right now. That was the first place in which power was distributed, not just or vested, not just in a monarchic authority in the UK, but but where lords and the vassals of the king, basically advocated for a more reasonable distribution of power and authority and influence, and so over centuries that has accumulated into a system that has allowed for the broader sharing of both power and responsibility, but also opportunity. And so I will say that as it relates to these families that are out there trying to do what's best for themselves, of course, but ultimately as commercial activities, trying to do what's best for their customers, for their suppliers, for their employees, for all of their stakeholders, even if these organizations are inherently self-interested, it behooves them to take care of the ecosystems within which that commercial activity is embedded. And you can't just retreat within the castle walls and bury your head in the sand, so to speak, metaphorically, and ignore what's happening in the world, because ultimately, danger will darken your doorstep. And so part of what we are recognizing among the enduring enterprises that we studied in the book is that those that seem to overcome all of the external and internal shocks that can destabilize and ultimately destroy any private enterprise, the ones that nurture a healthy environment around them. I don't just mean the natural environment. I mean the commercial environment and the social environment and the economic environment as well, are the ones that tend to do better in the longer run. And so even if it's out of, as I believe, Goldman Sachs describes internally, long-term greed, which is sort of a suppression of your short-termism, not thinking in quarters, but thinking in quarter centuries, it then behooves these organizations to begin to think about the meta trends that are playing out in the world that are undermining trust and that are, that represent very real and significant risks to the stability of the societies and ultimately the businesses themselves, whether it's demographic trends or trends in social cohesion or trends in climate and so forth.
Yeah, one of the, I don't remember, might have been Deng Xiaoping, although I want to say it wasn't. One of the Chinese leaders in the years pretty soon after Mao was asked his opinion on the French Revolution, and he said, "Too soon to say."
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that quote. And
I like that. If I could change one thing sort of educationally in civics education or really economics education, it would be to give every American who has the franchise or a column under his byline a deeper and richer and more nuanced understanding of the idea of public goods as economically defined.
That's brilliant. But building on this, you're looking for suggestions. One other suggestion is give every American a passport, have them go travel and see a little bit of the world and see, and learn to appreciate what they have. And I often tell the story when I was in college, I drove from 116th Street on Broadway in New York to Caracas, basically. And I did it with 2 friends of mine who came out of Massachusetts, had never left Massachusetts. And when we crossed into Mexico, they, one of them looked around and asked me very genuinely, why do they live like this? And I had to break the news that that's in fact the way 90% of the world lives.
Welcome to Earth.
Exactly. That most Americans don't really appreciate what they have. And that's a tragedy, I think, because
Well, I think for people to benefit from travel, they have to be sort of prepared to benefit from travel, because
that's true too.
a lot of Americans visit Europe and they see the nice part of Amsterdam, the nice part of London, the nice part of Paris, maybe Zurich, and they think Europe is a paradise. And if that's all you saw, you would think that. It'd be like if you went to New York and you never really left the Upper West Side, or you
Exactly.
just
Or you go to Santo Domingo and you go to the beach and suck pina coladas all day and not look beyond the resort where you're staying. Absolutely. I mean, you have to prepare them. But I think
20 years ago, I did that in Santo Domingo, and it was great. I loved it.
for
But
sure.
I was actually working there for a job I had at the time. I was doing some consulting for a corporate security group, and so I went and I was actually writing about crime affecting foreign businesses and things
There
like
you
that.
go.
And it turns out there's a lot more to it than what you see at the resort and all that. But it's still a kind of
But I got to say, Kevin, it's impressive how you're soaking in the key messages from our book and elevating them to the stage of social policy issues, which is very much one of our agendas as well.
you don't
Um,
have to flatter me that much. We're going to put the link in the show notes anyway to the book, so it's
no, it's true. We've been through a bunch of interviews, believe me, since the book came out, and not everybody has wrestled with it.
So I've written a few political books, and normally what happens, I don't know what your experience is like, but I'm a conservative, so I would do a lot of conservative talk radio shows, and they will ask you, your publisher will ask you to write like 7 sample questions for interviews and stuff, and 9 interviews out of 10, and probably 19 out of 20, they would just read my sample questions in the order I sent to them, and so I got to where my mouth was actually literally tired of saying the same sentences over and over and over again. So we try to have a little variety here and a little diversity, even if you will. We are running up against the clock here, so but we're not quite out of time yet. So what have we not talked about yet that you guys would like to talk about, or that you think would be useful and fruitful for our listeners and viewers to know about that I haven't brought up in the conversation yet?
Well, Kevin, first, I want to appreciate you for taking an interest in the topic and for sharing this with your listeners. I think ultimately we're all feeling a sense of unease that's coming from news flow, from events unfolding, and so forth, in a changing world. This is true of any change. This feels more structural and systematic, and at least the folks that we've been talking to about this, and the folks we talked to in the context of the book, have been looking for a new playbook as it relates to coping with uncertainty, coping with turbulence, coping with turmoil. And the biggest thing that we can suggest to folks like that is to really be proactive, to be preemptive, not wait for the next shock to hit. Doesn't matter what it is: a trade war, tariffs, geopolitical turmoil, succession. There are going to be all sorts of risks that are swirling. But one thing that we've observed in these enduring companies, the ones that really not just survive, but actually thrive in complicated places over decades, and so not just for months, but for years and across generations, are ones that treat crises as endemic. And that they don't chase the upside, they manage for the downside. And that over the longer run, that tends to actually produce an outperformance in terms of not only the valuation, the value creation of those businesses, but also the cash flow that these businesses can put off and the positive impact they can have on the communities that they serve. And so, to the extent possible, encouraging leaders to be proactive in their planning, to not just anticipate that next year will be this year plus 2%, plus 5%, plus 10%, but really truly imagine what a downside scenario would look like and stress test our assumptions is something that we don't see enough leaders doing. So if we can encourage anybody, to just sort of begin to get comfortable being uncomfortable, do the equivalent of taking a cold shower and try to guess or anticipate what life will be like and not wait for the news to impose that on them.
And to resist the seductiveness of chasing, as Devin says, just quarterly earnings, and look to managing with a mindset of just in case as opposed to just in time, as we put in the book, which means, also understanding that managing for prudence costs something. You have to, it's like having a spare tire in a car. And it doesn't come for free, but boy, are you thrilled to have it when you need it. but it occupies space, it's heavy, and so forth. There's an organizational version of that, but it takes leaders who are willing to understand that and build it into their operating systems.
Yeah, my version of that is a shoebox full of Swiss francs and a 45, but I'm not running a large, complex organization. Just the Williamson household here. So I didn't drive all the way to Venezuela, but I have driven from the northern border of Mexico to the southern border of Mexico, and it is. I did it in 1991, I guess, and it's quite a drive. And but I figured if I ever have to flee the United States and I don't go north, which would be too obvious. At least I've done the drive one time before.
There's a lot more space up here, Kevin, and some in-laws apparently. So.
And it's one.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I do prefer the cool weather up there and some beautiful forests up there in Canada. Canada would be a good place just to disappear. I think if you're what 300 miles north of the border, the population density is roughly the same as Mars.
Yep.
And you can just
and the temperature in the middle of winter.
Although I think that I'm aging out of my wilderness survival, live off the land, hunt bears with a spear kind of years. I just don't know that I'm still up to it. I like my creature comforts too much and my nice comfortable bed. So I guess I'll just have to stay here and fight it out. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Good luck with the book. We will put a link to it in the show notes, and let us know the next time something comes up. Talk to you later.
Terrific. Thank you, Ken.